The lights are dimming on one of America's most recognizable symbols. McDonald's, the fast food empire that once represented the unstoppable march of Western capitalism, is now facing an unprecedented crisis. Not from competitors, not from changing tastes, but from something far more calculated, a coordinated assault by two of the world's most powerful nations. This is the story of how a hamburger became a weapon, how tariffs turned into cultural warfare, and how the future of American influence may hinge on whether families in Asia can still afford a Big Mac. When convenience became controversy. For decades, McDonald's stood as more than just a restaurant chain. It was a promise. Walk into any city, from São Paulo to Seoul, from Cairo to Chicago, and those golden arches meant the same thing: affordable food, familiar taste, and a slice of the American experience. But something fundamental has shifted. The company that built its empire on accessibility is now watching that foundation crumble. Global sales have declined. Customer traffic is dropping. And the explanation? People across the world are starting to believe that McDonald's has priced itself out of reach. Yet the real threat isn't coming from customer complaints or market trends. It's coming from government offices in Beijing and New Delhi, where officials have identified McDonald's not as a business, but as a target. Recent developments suggest that China and India, nations that together house nearly 3 billion people, are preparing to unleash tariffs that could reach as high as 300% on American fast food operations. The implications are staggering. A meal that costs a family of 4 the equivalent of $12 today could suddenly demand $40. A weekly treat would become a monthly luxury if it remains affordable at all. This isn't a story about economics alone. It's about identity, sovereignty, and the question of who gets to define what progress looks like in the 21st century. Beijing's calculated strike. The first blow came quietly, buried in internal communications from China's trade ministry. But once the details leaked, the message was impossible to ignore. Chinese officials have drafted plans to impose massive duties on virtually every component that keeps McDonald's operational in their country. We're not talking about minor adjustments to import taxes. This is a comprehensive assault on the entire supply chain: beef, dairy products, proprietary sauces, even the branded wrappers that hold each sandwich. The intent is clear: make American fast food so expensive that it becomes irrelevant. Consider what this means for ordinary Chinese families. In cities like Shenzhen or Chengdu, where McDonald's has built a presence over decades, a Big Mac currently sells for roughly the equivalent of $3.50. Under the proposed tariff structure, that same burger could cost upwards of $10, perhaps more. For China's emerging middle class, already navigating an economy that has cooled considerably from its breakneck growth of previous years, this transforms McDonald's from an everyday option into something reserved for special occasions. In Shanghai alone, where more than 250 McDonald's locations serve millions of customers annually, the financial impact would be immediate and severe. But to understand Beijing's strategy, you have to look beyond the balance sheets. China's leadership has spent years building a narrative around self-sufficiency and national pride. Foreign brands, once welcomed as symbols of modernization, are now increasingly viewed through a lens of suspicion. McDonald's, with its unmistakably American identity, has become a convenient target, a way for officials to demonstrate that China no longer needs to import Western culture to thrive. This is where domestic competitors enter the picture. Brands like Dicos and Wallace have grown rapidly across Chinese cities, offering burgers and fried chicken that feel familiar but carry a distinctly local identity. They're cheaper, more adaptable to regional tastes, and most importantly, they're Chinese. By making McDonald's prohibitively expensive, Beijing isn't just protecting its market, it's reshaping cultural preferences. The message to Chinese consumers is subtle but powerful. You don't need America's golden arches to live a modern life, and the financial stakes are enormous. China represents McDonald's second largest market globally, generating billions in revenue every year. If that market becomes inaccessible or unprofitable, the consequences will echo from corporate boardrooms in Chicago to cattle ranches in the American Midwest. Beijing has fired the opening shot, but they wouldn't be acting alone for long. India joins the fight. Within 72 hours of the Chinese tariff leak, signals began emerging from New Delhi that India was prepared to follow suit. Indian lawmakers, already sensitive to questions about foreign dominance in domestic markets, began floating proposals that would place heavy restrictions on American fast food chains. The targets were specific: imported ingredients, specialized packaging materials, and even certain dairy products that McDonald's relies on to maintain consistency across its global operations. The economic justification was straightforward. India has its own thriving fast food sector, from established names like Haldiram's and Wow Momo to newer chains like Burger Singh that explicitly market themselves as Indian alternatives to Western brands. These companies have struggled to compete with the marketing power and brand recognition that McDonald's brings to the table. In Mumbai, a city of more than 20 million people, McDonald's operates over 80 locations. That's 80 highly visible reminders every single day that American companies dominate India's urban landscape. For politicians looking to rally nationalist sentiment, it's an easy target. But the calculation runs deeper than protecting local businesses. India's middle class is expanding at a remarkable pace. Millions of families are entering the consumer economy every year, and what they buy, and where they buy it, has become politically significant. Food, in particular, has emerged as a powerful symbol of national identity. By framing McDonald's as a foreign intrusion rather than a neutral convenience, India's leadership can turn economic policy into cultural politics. Families who choose local options aren't just saving money. They're participating in a movement that positions itself as defending Indian sovereignty. There's another layer to consider. India and China are historical rivals, often competing for influence across Asia and beyond. For both nations to move in the same direction on any issue is rare. That they're doing so against American interests sends an unmistakable signal to Washington. The world's largest democracies and its largest authoritarian state can find common ground when it comes to challenging U.S. cultural and economic dominance. Together, these two nations represent an astonishing concentration of global population and purchasing power. If they succeed in marginalizing McDonald's, they'll have demonstrated that even America's most iconic brands are vulnerable. And in Washington, that realization was already setting off alarm bells. Washington prepares to strike back. The White House response was swift and, honestly, pretty predictable. When news broke that both Beijing and New Delhi were considering major tariffs on American fast food, President Donald Trump's administration moved into crisis mode. Within just a few hours, senior officials were convening emergency meetings. By the following morning, leaks from inside the administration revealed plans for aggressive retaliation. Trump himself took to the cameras, his message characteristically blunt. This isn't about hamburgers. This is an assault on the American way of life. Behind that rhetoric, the administration was preparing economic countermeasures on a massive scale. Documents suggested Washington was considering tariffs as high as 200% on Chinese steel, electronics, and consumer goods, sectors representing over $300 billion in annual trade. The logic was simple. If Asia wants to target America's cultural exports, Washington will respond by going after the supply chains that power Asia's manufacturing economies. But there was a problem. Economists across the political spectrum warned that retaliatory tariffs would backfire domestically. Higher duties on Chinese electronics would inevitably raise prices for American consumers. Televisions, computers, smartphones, kitchen appliances, all the products that families depend on, could see price increases of 10 to 15%. With inflation already running above 5% nationally, the prospect of another price shock was politically dangerous. Families in swing states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Arizona were already feeling squeezed. Adding more pressure to household budgets could spell disaster for any administration. Trump dismissed these concerns with characteristic confidence. Surrounded by American flags and flanked by representatives from the steel industry, he declared that the United States would not surrender a single inch of its economic sovereignty. He framed the conflict not as a trade dispute, but as a test of national will, drawing parallels to Cold War confrontations where symbols and ideology carried as much weight as military power. Financial markets, however, weren't buying it. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped nearly 500 points in a single trading session, erasing billions of dollars in value from pension funds and retirement accounts. Automakers began quietly preparing for disruptions in their supply chains. Agricultural groups started running worst-case scenarios. And while Washington drew its line, capitals across the developing world were watching carefully. For some, America's aggressive response looked like confirmation that the era of unchallenged U.S. dominance was ending. For others, it looked like an opportunity. The BRICS factor. A movement goes global. The tariff war that began with China and India didn't stay contained for long. Instead, it began spreading across what analysts call the Global South, nations that have grown increasingly skeptical of Western economic power. In Brazil, officials inside the Ministry of Agriculture began quietly discussing whether they should implement their own restrictions on American fast food chains. The reasoning echoed what Beijing had already articulated. Why should Brazil's beef ranchers, soybean farmers, and food processors compete on unequal terms with multinational corporations backed by decades of brand recognition and marketing muscle? Russia took a more aggressive stance. State-controlled media outlets ran nightly segments celebrating what they characterized as the decline of America's burger empire. Anchors framed every McDonald's closure abroad as evidence that Western consumer culture was losing its grip on the global imagination. Even South Africa, where American fast food chains have long been fixtures in shopping centers and urban areas, began seeing political movements call for what they termed food sovereignty, a euphemism that often precedes taxes or outright restrictions on foreign businesses. The significance of these movements becomes clear when you consider the numbers. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, collectively represents more than 40% of the world's population. Their combined economies account for nearly 1/3 of global GDP. If these nations begin coordinating their policies, even loosely, they possess the power to fundamentally reshape global trade. For McDonald's, this represents an existential threat. The company built its success on the idea that American brands could operate anywhere. Now, entire regions are questioning that assumption. Europe, meanwhile, found itself caught in an uncomfortable position. Brussels issued no formal statement, but leaked documents revealed deep divisions within the European Union. Northern European economies, heavily dependent on stable trade relationships with both the United States and China, feared the economic fallout of choosing sides. Southern European nations, particularly those reliant on American agricultural imports, urged caution. France and Germany, both battling inflation rates above 6%, questioned whether supporting Washington's retaliatory strategy would cost them more politically than it was worth. The European silence wasn't neutrality. It was paralysis, and it revealed just how fragile America's traditional alliances have become in an increasingly multipolar world. For McDonald's executives, the crisis was no longer just about protecting market share. It was about legitimacy, whether an American brand could still claim a place in societies that were actively questioning the value of Western cultural exports. And as governments debated abroad, the consequences began hitting closer to home. The conflict that began in Beijing and New Delhi was now reverberating across the American interior. McDonald's is far more than a restaurant chain. It's actually one of the largest single purchasers of American agricultural products. Every year, the company buys billions of pounds of beef from ranchers in Nebraska and Kansas. It contracts for massive volumes of potatoes from Idaho farms. It sources dairy products from Wisconsin processors. If access to Asian markets collapses, Those contracts could evaporate almost overnight. Agricultural groups sounded the alarm immediately. The American Farm Bureau Federation issued projections suggesting that losing Chinese and Indian markets could reduce farm incomes by 10 to 15% in a single growing season. Cattle ranchers warned of oversupply. Too many animals, not enough buyers. Potato growers began preparing for the possibility of unsold crops rotting in storage. One agriculture lobbyist summarized the mood grimly. When McDonald's catches a cold, American farmers get pneumonia. The damage extends far beyond the farm gate. Packaging companies in Ohio that produce millions of burger wrappers and French fry containers depend on McDonald's global demand. Logistics companies in Illinois that coordinate supply chains have built their business models around the company's massive distribution needs. Dairy processors in Minnesota rely on consistent orders to keep their operations profitable. If Asian demand disappears, production lines slow down. Shifts get cut. Small towns that depend on these facilities for tax revenue and employment face serious economic pressure. Wall Street was already pricing in the damage. Analysts at major investment banks, including J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, issued downgrades on McDonald's stock, warning that the contagion could spread across exchange-traded funds and pension portfolios. A company valued at nearly $200 billion suddenly looked vulnerable. Retirement accounts that millions of Americans depend on were being affected by a trade war most people didn't fully understand. And while farmers and investors struggled to contain the economic fallout, another front was opening, one that might prove even more consequential in the long run. The battle over burgers wasn't staying confined to trade ministries and corporate boardrooms. It was spilling onto screens across Asia, where governments were weaponizing social media and state television to reshape public opinion. In China, state-run television networks launched coordinated programming aimed directly at McDonald's. Nightly broadcasts characterized the Golden Arches as a symbol of Western arrogance and cultural imperialism. Anchors spoke of each Happy Meal as a subtle form of ideological infiltration, designed to make Chinese children identify more with American values than their own heritage. The messaging was amplified explosively on social media platforms. Hashtags calling for boycotts of McDonald's gathered billions of impressions on Weibo, China's dominant social network. Short-form videos showed young people dramatically throwing French fries into trash bins or walking past McDonald's locations while promoting Chinese alternatives. Influencers with millions of followers began incorporating anti-McDonald's messaging into their content, often wrapping it in patriotic language. Choosing a local burger chain wasn't just a consumer decision. It was framed as an act of national loyalty. In India, the campaign took a slightly different form. Local entrepreneurs seized the moment to position themselves as defenders of Indian culture and economic sovereignty. Burger Singh, a domestic chain specializing in spice-heavy alternatives to Western fast food, rolled out advertising campaigns explicitly positioning their paneer burgers as the true Indian answer to the Big Mac. Wow! Momo, another rapidly growing chain, launched initiatives that directly linked every purchase to supporting Indian businesses and keeping money within the domestic economy. For millions of young Indian consumers, particularly in urban areas, food choices suddenly carried political weight. Were you supporting your country, or were you supporting a foreign corporation that sent profits back to Chicago? Governments in both Beijing and New Delhi welcomed these grassroots movements. Organic-seeming campaigns provided political cover for tariffs and restrictions, making harsh economic policies look like responses to popular sentiment rather than top-down decisions. What had begun as a trade dispute was transforming into something far more powerful, a mass movement questioning the very legitimacy of American cultural presence. And for McDonald's, this represented a threat that couldn't be countered with lobbying or price adjustments. The company was facing an erosion of its fundamental value proposition, The idea that American brands represented aspiration and quality. By this point, the conflict had transcended food, tariffs, or even trade policy. The Golden Arches had become a proxy for something much larger, a test of whether American cultural influence could survive in an increasingly multipolar world. McDonald's isn't just valuable because it sells burgers. It's valuable because for decades it represented the global reach of American culture. Walk into a McDonald's anywhere on Earth, and you encountered a standardized experience that communicated American efficiency, reliability, and aspiration. That intangible quality, the ability to shape how billions of people think about modernity and success, is what analysts call soft power, and it's now under direct assault. The questions being asked in Beijing and Mumbai aren't just about whether a Big Mac costs too much. They're about whether American symbols themselves still deserve their dominant position in global culture. If tariffs and boycotts can shake McDonald's, what does that mean for Apple's iPhones, which millions of people across Asia see as status symbols? What about Nike sneakers, which represent athletic aspiration worldwide? Or Hollywood films, which have shaped global entertainment preferences for generations? These brands have never been just products. They've been carriers of American narratives, stories about individualism, innovation, and opportunity. They've made American values feel universal. Now those stories are being challenged. In Shanghai, choosing where to eat lunch has become a quiet referendum on identity. In Delhi, buying a Happy Meal for your children invites questions about whether you're prioritizing convenience over cultural loyalty. Each skipped purchase doesn't just hurt McDonald's quarterly earnings, it chips away at the psychological infrastructure that has supported American influence for decades. And the implications extend far beyond one company's profits. If McDonald's can be marginalized this easily, no American brand is safe. The entire ecosystem of U.S. cultural exports, from entertainment to technology to fashion, faces the possibility of coordinated resistance from nations that have decided American dominance is no longer in their interest. This is what makes the current crisis so consequential. It's not about whether McDonald's survives as a company. The chain is financially robust enough to weather significant losses. It's about whether American cultural power itself can maintain its position in a world that's actively looking for alternatives. The tariff war over fast food is still unfolding. Policies are being debated, strategies are being adjusted, and diplomatic channels remain open. But regardless of how the immediate crisis resolves, something fundamental has already changed. For the first time in generations, American brands can no longer assume they'll be welcome everywhere. The idea that globalization means Americanization, that opening markets means opening them to U.S. companies and U.S. culture, has been decisively challenged. China and India have demonstrated that they possess both the economic leverage and the political will to push back against American cultural dominance. The BRICS nations have shown that coordinated action among developing economies can shift global power dynamics. And perhaps most significantly, millions of consumers across Asia have proven that they're willing to change their behavior based on political messaging. That cultural identity can outweigh brand loyalty. McDonald's will likely adapt. The company has survived regulatory challenges, health crises, and shifting consumer preferences before. It may reduce its presence in certain markets, localize more aggressively in others, or find new growth opportunities elsewhere. But the underlying question won't go away. Whose culture gets to define the future? For decades, the answer seemed obvious. American brands, American technology, American entertainment, these were the forces shaping how people around the world understood progress and modernity. Now that answer is being contested in real time, meal by meal, purchase by purchase, hashtag by hashtag. The Golden Arches that once stood as a universal symbol of convenience and aspiration have become a flashpoint in a much larger struggle. A struggle over economic sovereignty, cultural identity, and the power to shape what the 21st century will look like. This isn't just about burgers anymore. It never really was. It's about whether the world that emerges from this decade will still be organized around American symbols and American narratives, or whether we're witnessing the early stages of a fundamental realignment. The families in Beijing deciding whether to pay triple for a Big Mac aren't just making consumer choices. They're participating in a global conversation about power, identity, and belonging. And the outcome of that conversation will determine far more than what's on the menu. The real question facing all of us isn't what we're eating for dinner. It's whose vision of the future we're buying into. Is American influence collapsing under its own weight? Or will Washington find a way to reassert its cultural dominance? Can brands built on universality survive in an age of nationalism? And what kind of world emerges when burgers become weapons in a battle over identity? The answers are being written right now, not in conference rooms, but in the daily choices of billions of people deciding what their lunch says about who they are.